right, welcome everyone. This is the first chapter where we're going to talk about generally what psychology is. We're going to go through the first chapter, which is just all on what is psychology, and hopefully at the end of the chapter you come out with a little bit more information and a little bit better of an idea of what psychology is and how we study it from sort of the scientific perspective. So let's go ahead and jump into this here. All right, so chapter 1, what is psychology? Let's kind of talk through generally what this is. And as we go through this chapter, you're going to see that we're going to cover basically these 4 main learning objectives. And we'll highlight each one as we go through it and when we're sort of addressing each one specifically. So the first one is going to explain how the scientific discipline of psychology emerged and just talk about some general information or general ideas about this field, specifically the idea of the mind, the body, behavior, and how these things all kind of work together. The second one, we're going to look at specifically some different subfields within psychology and talk about how these different subfields kind of operate and how they kind of approach the field in their own kind of way. We'll talk both about this idea of basic versus applied research and what that really means as we're looking at sort of this idea of studying psychology from a scientific perspective. The third learning objective, we'll talk about some themes in psychology and as well as the history of psychology, and we'll talk through how this has evolved over time and discuss and identify some key players or some key sort of researchers or scientists or psychologists who have made an impact in this development of the field throughout its history. And then lastly, we'll talk about some of the main sort of perspectives on psychology and how they might kind of play into how we approach psychology today, and what are some of these more overarching or general themes that might kind of be looked at as we're kind of going out, talking about this. So let's start off with our first learning objective. This first learning objective is where we're just going to kind of talk about what psychology is, how it came about, and also discuss just some of this idea of the mind, the body, behavior, and how these things kind of relate to one another. All right, so I'm going to start off here by talking about just this image. So what is psychology? I think this image is a great sort of first place to start. And looking at it, there's so many things we can kind of pick apart and talk about how psychology might fit into what's going on here. Just a few that come to mind as we're looking at this. I can see first off, there is what seems to be a family. So we could talk about different psychological aspects of family dynamics, relationships. We see different emotions going on. We could talk about childhood development or developmental psychology and look at how things might evolve, how we change and grow over time. I also see maybe there might be some elements of some cross-cultural psychology in here, looking at how different perspectives or opinions and different lives sort of play together and what that means or how that might affect our psychology in this sense. So there's a lot just from one image, kind of what's going on here. And if I had to kind of, sum this all up, I think what's really cool about psychology is that we can kind of see how it relates to a lot of different aspects of our lives. And so what I hope you get from this class and as we go through this is a lot of information and a lot of new perspectives that maybe you can start to apply and just look at in your own life and see how a lot of what we talk about might apply to some of your day-to-day living and just things that you experience going through your life. All right, so let's jump into this. And again, getting back to this idea of what people might think, what some of your own initial perceptions of what psychology is. Maybe you came in with some ideas of what you thought of when you thought of psychology. Maybe, your thought process was that psychology is just about therapy sessions and someone's just sitting on a couch talking to a therapist and getting advice or help on how to go about their day-to-day lives and deal with different issues. Maybe you thought about laboratory rats in a study or doing research on other people or looking at sort of how different perspectives in the field might treat patients and treat people with different psychological disorders. And all of these things are aspects of psychology. So all of these really do play a part in this field, and they all kind of come into play. And we're going to talk about a lot of these as we go through this. We'll talk about sort of some of these different perspectives and explain kind of that each of these things is a way that we study psychology, and they've all kind of played their role and helped the field develop as time has gone on. All right, so some early work in psychology, where this all kind of started. I like to kind of start here because I think it really kind of paints a picture and explains what we mean when we talk about psychology. And even as early as just understanding the word psychology and what it means. And it really comes from these two sort of roots of psyche and logia or logia. And so psyche meaning the breath or the spirit or the soul, and logia simply meaning just the study of. So the study of the spirit, the soul, the mind. And so early in psychology, a lot of the times there wasn't this huge distinction between psychologists and philosophers. There's a lot of overlap in early psychology with a lot of philosophy and what we study in that field as well. And we actually see a lot of early philosophers kind of bringing up some questions that we studied throughout psychology, like questions of the mind, questions of the brain. Are these two things different? Are they the same? And this kind of leads us to, what we call sort of this mind-body problem, or how we distinguish, how we study the mind and the body, and whether those two things are the same. So our physical brain and our psychological mind. Are these two things really the same thing? Do they kind of operate in two different ways? Do they communicate with one another, or how does this kind of all play out? And these are kind of questions and things that early psychologists and philosophers tried to sort of study and try to debate how this sort of played out. And so when we look at this idea, right, we look at the mind, the body, and behavior. Psychology is really about kind of tying these three things together, right? So we look at this from a purpose of scientific research, scientific study, and we're going to talk about that as we go throughout this course, but specifically that we do empirical observation. So we have falsifiable information. We test things in appropriate, scientific ways to uncover information about what we are trying to learn. And so that is a core component of psychology, is the scientific approach to how we study it. And we'll see how that's developed throughout the history of psychology, but especially today, this is a big sort of piece of how we approach the field. Also behavior being a big component, and we'll see where this developed as well, but how we observe people's behavior, their actions. This is how we sort of collect data. This is how we peer into the mind, is often through their behavior and what we can see in sort of this outward approach. And then finally, we have the mind, right, which is the thing I think a lot of people think about when they think about psychology, and how this sort of, really is what we're studying versus, how well are we actually able to study it? And so I think what's really cool when we talk about sort of the mind and the brain, and what we're going to see as we talk through this throughout the semester, is that these two things often do overlap quite a bit, but sometimes we have a hard time kind of measuring one versus the other. And we'll see as science and technology has improved, we've gotten much better at measuring the brain, right? Doing imaging, doing neuro techniques to actually see what's going on inside the brain. But the mind is still sort of this ethereal thing that is a little bit harder to really study from a scientific perspective. And so we kind of draw these connections between the two and argue whether they are even the same thing or not. And generally speaking, I think the consensus now is that, we treat the brain, the physical brain, as an analogy to the mind. And so a lot of what we measure, a lot of what we detect in the brain, we say is used to explain the mind as well. But this is going to be a theme that we'll kind of talk through and keep kind of addressing as we go through this semester. All right, so this really is kind of what I was talking about, but this mind-body problem came about as early from early philosophers, specifically Rene Descartes, and this idea of dualism, right? So we argued that the mind and the body are two separate things. And so we have the physical mind, and then the more ethereal, we have the physical body or the brain, and then the more ethereal mind that is sort of the soul, something separate from the physical realm. And he actually argued that the pineal gland, which you can see over on the right-hand side, that this was actually sort of that seed of sort of the soul, and this is how those two things communicated with one another. We know now that's not really what the purpose of this is, but it was interesting seeing sort of that really central small point within the mind or within the brain that they argued that this was sort of where those two things were able to communicate with one another. And so again, I think this is really interesting to kind of look at and break down, but generally speaking, we have identified now that this is not really a thing, and most people are going to be of the argument that the mind and the body are not two separate things, but instead we use the body or the physical brain as an analogy to the mind. And so we'll kind of wrap up this section with this quote from Steven Pinker that says, "The mind is what the brain does." And this is really sort of the modern approach, or the modern way that we kind of approach the study of psychology. And so we say that the mind and the brain are one. And so we can study the mind by studying the brain. And the brain is something we can measure, we can observe, we can image. And by doing that, we start to learn or get insight into what the mind is actually doing. All right, and so we're going to switch now to covering the second learning objective, which is going to talk about some of the different fields or the work that someone might do with a degree in psychology. So we're going to talk about some of these subfields and kind of go through what each of these might do and how different degrees and different educational backgrounds kind of play into what each of these things kind of contribute, or how you could kind of approach these from different background perspectives. So what do psychologists do? So generally speaking, when we talk about psychology, a lot of the goals here are to develop research, right? Develop information, learn information, and spread and share that information to other people interested in what you have found. But when we talk about research, there's really kind of two different types of research that we need to kind of distinguish between. And those being basic research and applied research. And we'll also see here how applied practice kind of fits into this as well. But generally speaking, we have basic research which often is really kind of looking at some fundamental components, or the actual workings of how things might work in a laboratory controlled setting. And so if we think about this, we think about these two sort of different types of research. We really have, like I said, basic research, which is something that is going to look at small scale fundamental principles of what is going on. So basic research might look at, how does your eye actually detect information? What are the physical kind of traits of the wavelengths of light that come into your eye, and what is that doing in your attention to capture different things that are important in the scene around you? And so the basic research is going to focus on understanding those fundamental principles, those inner workings of the actual brain and eyes, and how that actually takes place. Applied research, on the other hand, takes that information and builds upon it in more of an applied setting. So what does that mean? What can we take away from information that we've gleaned from basic research on how our eyes capture light, and what that means to our interpretation of the scenes around us? Well, applied research might take that and say, well, we know some people have difficulty detecting different types of light. They might be colorblind to one type of color, and we can use this information to design systems, design different, areas of use for people that take into account these physical limitations that have been learned through basic research. And we'll see here, again, if we kind of go back to this cycle that we're looking at, we also see that applied practice kind of plays a role here as well. And this is often more from sort of the clinical side of psychology, which we'll talk more about as we go. But when we see this idea of basic research, maybe understanding what the actual, pharmaceutical drug might do to someone with a particular, psychological disorder, we can see sort of from a basic perspective, we understand the workings of the drug. We understand what that does from a physiology standpoint, from a neurotransmitter standpoint. And then we can apply this in the real world and say, okay, in a real person, we see these effects take place when they take this medication. And then we can apply this in more of that practice setting, in this clinical setting, where we say, okay, people that suffer from this might take this medication and it helps them improve. And we can see what that does in their actual day-to-day lives, in their actual, inner workings of what they're dealing with and what they're going through. And that really has more of that applied practice side of things, where we can look at how does this affect people in their real world day-to-day lives. All right, and so again, here are some examples of some basic research in psychology and how we can kind of break down and just look at some more further examples of this. And you can see the different areas, different topic areas of psychology, and how we kind of see examples of basic research and what someone might look at. So my background is very heavy into cognitive psychology or human factors psychology. So I kind of gave an example here of the color blindness and how that might work for designing systems. But we can also see, again, more in the developmental or personality psychology, how we might actually study these from a basic perspective. We can see a lot of these different areas and try to understand what basic research really kind of means when looking at it in these different realms of psychology. And this contrasts to, again, more of these applied settings where we can see when we look at, again, my background being more in this applied cognitive psychology. And I'll give you another example here of kind of comparing these two different types of approaches. So again, basic research might look at the actual inner workings of the mind. It might use different ways to detect neural signals like EEG and understand actually what electrical impulses, electrical signals are coming through, and what that means, what the patterns are, and how we can work to distinguish and interpret some of those patterns. Whereas applied research, applied psychology might then try to design systems or design keyboards to decrease error, maybe, design flight mechanics that, designing a cockpit that optimizes how people tend to be distracted by certain things or overlap their utility in one thing versus another. So sort of, I'll give you like a fun little story, but my background again is in human factors, and some of the early human factors research really came about from studying aircraft design in early World War II aircrafts. And one of the interesting areas that human factors psychologists were brought in was they found a lot of pilots were sort of ejecting from their aircraft when trying to land. And they didn't understand why this was happening, and they thought maybe it was a mechanical error or something else. And it turns out that, well, what they did is whoever designed the aircraft or the cockpit had two levers that looked very similar to one another, and they were laid out right next to each other. And one of those levers was to deploy the landing gear, and the other lever was to eject out of the aircraft. And so while maybe engineers and designers thought that that was the most efficient way to route those cables and design those systems, psychologists came in and said, well, this is really bad practice, because under stressful situations, under, this practice of trying to land an aircraft, people might not be able to distinguish between these two things as well as they would be able to when being able to fully focus on that. And so I really like human factors psychology. I think it's cool and able to kind of look at some of these other areas and as a niche component that I don't think a lot of people think of when they think of psychology. So just a little fun story there. If that's something that interests you, it's another field of psychology that does exist. All right, so again, looking at the applied side, we can see some examples here as well. Again, consumer, educational, there it is, human factors psychology, designing different things that actually are effective or applied in the real world. And I think that's really kind of the takeaway here. If you look at basic research, it's more about understanding fundamental principles, and applied research is more about applying those principles in the real world and seeing what we can do to better ourselves or other people through this knowledge. And so when we look at sort of how we understand this knowledge, understand this research, there's kind of a different, multiple different kind of pieces to this as well. So there's the research itself, right? So understanding the research, what the problem is, finding ways to solve that problem, or at least answer the research question, is its own sort of challenge and thing that people have to kind of learn how to do and work through. And so designing research to solve a specific problem or answer a specific question is an important piece of psychology and psychology from a scientific perspective. There's also the practice of psychology, right? So think about clinical psychologists or practicing psychologists that apply techniques, apply things like, behavioral training, cognitive behavioral therapy, ways that they can help people through the practical application of knowledge that has been gained through past research and past understanding. And then there's also sort of this like translational area of understanding and how we use this to sort of, take these basic information that we learn from basic research and translate it or apply it in more of a practical application sense. And so these are all kind of different ways that we use our knowledge and our understanding to engage in psychology and the study of psychology in general. Let's talk quickly about clinical psychology, because I think this is what a lot of people think about when they think about psychology. And when we kind of get into this idea of what psychology is, I think this is people's first stop on the train, if you will, right? Most people think about clinical psychology as, well, all that psychology is. And we'll see there is a lot more to it. But this is a big and important piece of psychology. And so I want to kind of cover it a little bit here as well. And so generally speaking, we kind of have three major different types of clinical psychologists. So there are just sort of general clinical psychologists that is their main focus. That is what they do. Oftentimes they have a PhD or a PsyD in psychology. They might engage in research and designing further research. If they have a PhD, they might be more focused on practice and actual treatment if they have something like a PsyD. So these are two kind of different degrees that someone might pursue if they were sort of looking to practice psychology from more of a clinical setting. There's also psychiatrists, which are a little bit different. And I think some people don't always understand the difference between psychiatrists and psychologists. But psychiatrists are actually medically trained professionals. So they have gone through med school, they've completed a medical degree, and then they have chosen to specialize their medical degree in psychology. And so while they might perform research and things of that nature as well, they're often practicing practicing is a big component of how they operate here too. So one additional benefit or ability that psychiatrists have is to prescribe medications. So psychologists don't actually have this ability. They really rely more on just the behavioral or cognitive approaches to treatment, whereas psychiatrists can actually prescribe medications that may or may not be relevant in sort of certain diagnoses or things like that. And then last, we have sort of this idea of counseling psychologists. And these often are people that might have master's degrees or certificates that focus more on just those more general psychological principles of helping sort of more average day-to-day people undergo and better themselves in different ways of their life. And so research is less of a focus in terms of creating it. They might read research and apply those new techniques, but they're less involved in creating new research as sort of just a counseling psychologist. So you can see here that there are lots of different tiers and lots of different sort of educational degrees that someone might get to go into this field. And they're all kind of responsible for doing different things and play a slightly different role in the overall sort of field of psychology. And so I think it's cool to kind of see, at least especially from a clinical perspective, how many different ways you could approach this and where you can kind of fit in as a role here. All right, and so that kind of wraps up that section. We're going to move on to the third learning objective here, which is going to kind of go through more the history of psychology. And so we'll see how it's evolved over time and also talk about some of the main sort of players or the main people that have influenced some of these major movements or major advancements within the field of psychology throughout sort of its history, if you will. All right, so I like putting this up. I like talking about sort of the general history, and we're gonna break down sort of each of these, or at least most of these, in more detail. But I do want to kind of lay this out so you have a mental framework of generally the large scale scope of how psychology has advanced over time. And so you can see early 1800s where we started was this idea of phrenology. And if you're not familiar with phrenology, it's really the study of the skull. And early on, the theories were sort of this idea that the skull itself had different grooves and lumps and shapes to it, and you could interpret those shapes to map onto different traits about that person. A lot of these studies have been sort of debunked, and we know now that that really isn't how we identify different characteristics of people. But that is really some of the early study of this idea, is that people were different, and we could observe these differences through the structural mapping of the skull itself. Again, we know now it's not the skull, but the brain underneath it that has more to do with this. And so things have sort of evolved in this way. Then you can see sort of as we go, 1875, 1878, we have things like functionalism, which we're going to break down and talk about. We have sort of the first psychology degree awarded in 1878. That was exciting. 1879, we have now the first psychology laboratory that's been established. Another big sort of milestone here. And then we get into the 1900s, and we can see where we get now this idea of structuralism, another one we're going to break down in more detail. We see Freud with his psychoanalysis, probably most famous psychology person for people outside of the field. Most people have heard of Sigmund Freud, or at least maybe to some degree. We're going to talk a little bit about what he did and how people have sort of built off of a lot of his early work. 1920s, we see Watson and Skinner, who are behaviorists, start to look at more of the behavior of people and use that as a way to measure and understand what they're doing. 1950s, we see the cognitive revolution. This is really exciting. We're going to talk more about this. And then wrapping up sort of in the mid-1900s with this idea of the humanistic perspective. So all of these sort of pieces kind of show the history of psychology in general. And it's not that old, right? Only 150 years or so. But again, a lot of this is built off of some of the early philosophy ideas and thoughts and things like that. But so let's kind of break down, let's go through some of these in a little bit more detail and talk about kind of what each of them is and how it moved the field forward. So let's start off with William James, and this was this idea of functionalism. So again, remember, we're kind of coming from this idea of phrenology, where we're studying the skull. And when we look at where this went from there, we look at this idea of functionalism. And this is really understanding sort of the functions or the individual like pieces of what the mind is doing. And so William James proposed this sort of idea that we could break down these processes into more simple components, more applied uses for these specific processes within sort of the function of the mind. And while this sounds great, I think that this was a great movement, a great sort of idea that came about. It's how it was implemented was not done to quite the degree that we probably now know that it needed to be. And so we do see some of the ideas come back through later approaches. But early on, this idea of functionalism had some great ideas, but a lot of what the theories were not falsifiable. They were really hard to test, really hard to actually argue against. And so when we talk about this from a scientific perspective, we have some limitations here for sure. After functionalism, we have, again, the first laboratory. This was funded by Wilhelm Wundt, and this he is widely sort of acknowledged as the father of modern psychology. He, had his lab in Germany in 1879 and generally started this idea of how do we study the conscious experience? So how do we study, again, this idea of the brain, the mind, what people experience, what they are, what their experience is. And this idea of psychology or the study of sort of people's experience or the mind came about. And so this was a historical kind of movement, an important piece of this process as we see sort of this develop as we go. And so after Wundt, we see, again, coming back, we see Edward Titchener studying structuralism. So structuralism is a little bit different than functionalism and looks more at kind of going back to this idea of the physical structure of the brain, but now can we see these individual structure components, right? So can we kind of break down what this part of the brain is doing or what this part of the brain is doing and what is it responsible for? And again, while great in principle and in concept, in practice, this was also kind of hard to test and hard to falsify. And so we're going to see some of these ideas get evolved upon. But when we look at the early approaches, I think we see a lot of potential issues or limitations to what they were able to do, at least in how we see it today. And so, again, this idea of structuralism, breaking down individual structures, individual components of the mind, of the brain, into these elements and trying to explain what those elements are responsible for. Hard to do when you can't actually see inside the brain itself. So that was definitely a limitation here of this approach. All right, that brings us to Freud and psychoanalysis. So Sigmund Freud was and is, I think, one of the most prolific people in the field, at least to people outside of the field. And so we see when we talk about Freud, a lot of what he did provided a great groundwork, I think, for the field. So when we look at this idea and we look at what he did, a lot of it was very helpful, and we've built off of a lot of his theories. He developed this idea of psychoanalysis, so looking at the mind, specifically the unconscious mind, and a lot of what Freud sort of believed and sort of his background was that it's the unconscious mind that is sort of the seed or the root of all of our problems and issues. And if we can just peer into the unconscious mind and understand it and learn from it, we can then solve and fix, what our conscious mind is dealing with. And so he used different techniques like free association, which is just when you say a word and then you say the first word that comes to mind. Things like dream analysis, so trying to analyze dreams as a way to sort of peer into that unconscious mind, and a lot of other techniques of this same nature, to try and access, uncover, understand the unconscious mind as a way to explain sort of what was going on behind the scenes. Again, a lot of his theories, a lot of his approaches have led to modern, the idea of modern sort of psychological therapy and how we sort of approach this idea. But most of his actual practices we've sort of moved on from and sort of just made a little bit better in how we do them today. So Freud, really big sort of person in the field, really important in the development of psychoanalysis and the development of psychotherapy, but a lot of his work has been improved upon. We don't use a lot of his methods that he used in his time. Then we have behaviorism. So the behaviorism movement is really interesting and really kind of said, okay, Freud was looking inside the mind. Let's instead look outside the body and see what are people actually doing? How can we measure, understand what's going on by observing their actual behaviors and what they're doing in the world, in the environment? And so both Watson and Skinner are two well-known famous behaviorists or psychologists who studied behavior. And this really sort of was trying to uncover this idea of how can we understand the mind, what people are, how this is working through their observable behaviors. And so we have examples like in this area, we have a lot of examples like learning, a lot of examples with reinforcement learning, things like that, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, looking at behavior itself to understand what is going on in the mind and how does psychology sort of work. So can we understand this by looking outward? And we'll see, again, as this evolves, how we kind of get to how these do still tie into a lot of what we study today. But this has evolved as well. Again, a lot of this is historical, though we see less evolution from the more recent, movements in psychology as well. And so I like this quote by Watson specifically. So it says, "Give me a dozen healthy infants well formed in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select: doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, and yes, even beggarman and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors." And so what's so cool, I think, about this approach, and specifically Watson's sort of idea here and his perspective, is that he really argued for this pretty much full nurture component of the nature versus nurture side of things. And so the idea that anybody can do anything, anybody can be whoever they want to be, really through just their learned behaviors and their experiences in life. We are not sort of predestined or created with certain abilities. And so I think this is a cool, optimistic sort of way of looking at things, looking at people, and we'll see sort of as we go this sort of approach and how it applies in different areas too. So again, Watson, behaviorism, this idea of we can train behaviors to teach people different things. Then we get to around the 1950s, this return to the mind, or the cognitive revolution. And so here we really look at this idea of the advancements in technology and our ability to actually see inside the brain, see what actually is going on, and measure what is changing, what is staying the same, what happens under different situations that people are experiencing. And this revolution really allowed us to be able to, well, peer into the mind and the brain in a way we've never really been able to before. And so being able to scan the mind when performing some task or some behavior and seeing what parts of the brain light up and are relevant during that task is a really cool sort of piece that we didn't have before. And so what's really cool too about this cognitive revolution is we see it develop alongside, well, just the advancements of technology. And so a lot of what was happening around this time too was the advancements of sort of computing and computers. And we see a lot of overlap, a lot of one-to-one comparison between computers and cognitive psychology. And a lot of what cognitive psychologists do is they look at the brain almost from a computational standpoint. So they say, we get some input from the world through our senses, through our eyes, our ears, our nose, and we do something, some computation, some function with that information. That is the brain, that is cognition. And then we output that decision, that behavior through interactions with our environment, whether that's through our actual physical interactions or some other means. We have sort of this input function output way of approaching things. And that's the same way computers work. And we see this sort of one-to-one sort of representation between computers and the mind, or cognition, through this cognitive revolution, if you will. And again, I study cognition a lot. That's sort of where my background comes in. And I just think it's really interesting to kind of see how this all kind of plays together. And as technology advances, how we're able to advance our understanding and our ability to see inside the brain as well, and what that means. We're going to talk more about this as the semester goes, but just to kind of highlight this here, the cognitive revolution being sort of this stepping stone in the history of psychology. All right, and then the last sort of major sort of component or milestone of psychology is this humanistic and positive psychology approach. And this was later, in the later 1900s. And really this idea was looking primarily from Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow, are two really big people in this field, at the idea that people are generally good. People want to better themselves, better their lives. And as psychologists, we need to sort of use that perspective and make sure that we maintain or incorporate that perspective to some degree. And so a lot of Freud's early views are very pessimistic in nature. We have deep-seated problems, unconscious desires, things that are negative in nature or connotation. And the humanistic or positive psychology movement really came about and said, well, that's not always the case, right? So there are plenty of times where people are perfectly healthy and happy, and we want to just live happy and healthy lives. We aren't these evil creatures underneath that have these deep-seated problems. And so I think this is another important approach that has helped sort of frame a lot of modern psychology in this sense as well. So even looking at psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, we take on some of these humanistic approaches today in the practice of maybe some of early Freud techniques or things like that. So kind of blending these two things together is important, and understanding that we've kind of moved on from this more negative connotation from Freud to more of a positive connotation, at least in this humanistic and positive psychology field. All right, so that really kind of wraps up objective 3, talking about the history and some of those major movements in psychology. So that brings us to our last learning objective here, or the 4th learning objective, which is going to, again, kind of cover generally some more higher level approaches or thinkings within the field. And we'll talk about, how we kind of might look at some different approaches to psychology in more of a bigger picture. Talk about some key sort of approaches to the field. So I like talking about this one here. So some just general themes in psychology, and we've talked a little bit about these throughout the lecture today, but looking at specifically this idea of nature versus nurture. And this is one that I just wanted to come back to and highlight a little bit more to make sure that we kind of all understand what these two things are saying. And so this idea of nature is really talking about genes, biology, more of the physiology or the physical side of who we are and what we are able to accomplish. And so nature is really about sort of this predetermined aspects that you get from genes and biology, whereas nurture is all about the environment. So learning, gaining information from the environment as we grow, as we age, as we learn. And oftentimes we'll see when we talk about different principles or different ways that people work, we'll see someone say, well, this is because of nature, or this is because of nurture. And I think this is a really good example over here on the right, the Ponzo illusion, where we see basically these two red lines and the horizontal lines there as well. And without those red lines in there, it's really hard to kind of observe those horizontal black lines as being the same length. But once we throw in some extra information, some reference points with those red vertical lines, it allows us to kind of see that. And so the argument here is this a learned phenomenon, or is this something that we are programmed to do? And so it's a challenging debate, right? So is it maybe that we are pre-programmed to observe the environment around us? We see things that are far away as being smaller, things that are closer up as being larger, and that's just a physical component of how things map onto our retina and how large they actually appear relative to one another. And so we see things far away, we expect that they should be small. Things up close, we expect they should be big. And if we look back at the example here, we see the thing in the distance we expect to be small, and so we think it might be smaller, and the thing up close we think should be bigger. And that maybe doesn't match our perception. And so we have these different kind of struggles to accurately interpret the size of these black horizontal lines. On the other hand, is this maybe more of a nurtured thing? So have we learned through our experiences in the world as we've gone out, as we have physically seen things in the world, or learned that, when you look at something far away, it looks smaller, and when you look at something close up, it looks bigger? Is that just something we've learned over time by experiencing these things in the world, and that has developed this understanding, this perception of how things should or should not appear? And so this is just a really kind of interesting way of approaching this and giving an example of how people can argue from both perspectives. And generally speaking, a lot of the consensus, especially today, is that oftentimes I think there's a lot of both that go into this, right? So it's not necessarily one or the other. It's more a mixture of the two, and together they combine to really create, our perceptions, our psychology, our nature, our ability. So I think that's an interesting sort of topic to kind of address here, and we'll see gets brought up throughout different discussions within psychology. Here's another example. It's really just another thing that we see here. But if you look at the lines on the top and look to see which ones are longer, which ones are shorter, and it's kind of hard to interpret, but you would probably make the argument that this line in the middle is the longest line. That is the one that probably appears to be the longest. But when we start actually highlighting and providing context, we see that, well, in reality, they are all the same length. And so, again, is this something that is a physical structure of our eyes, or something that we have maybe learned through interacting with things in our environment, in the world, and learning that this is what we should expect? So these are both two really fun illusions that kind of highlight these two differences between nature and nurture. And again, at the end of the day, we sort of see this outcome that it probably is a mixture of the two. And we also should talk, I think, about the idea of evolutionary psychology. So this idea of natural selection and how this fits into psychology, I think, is something that we'll see kind of occur, and discussion on it be brought up as we kind of go through this. And generally speaking, we can really kind of simplify this down into this very basic flowchart here. And the idea is just generally, does some trait, does some behavior, does some action, does it aid in our survival? And if it does, well, then we expect to see more of that action. So does caring for our children aid in our survival of our species? Well, yes. So we see people continue that action. If something does not help in our survival, well, we might see a decrease or less of that action in our population, in our group of people. And so this is really, the highest level of evolutionary psychology we'll really talk mostly about is just this idea of, if it's beneficial, we see more of it. If it's not beneficial, we see less of it. All right, I think another piece, or another sort of thing to understand and talk about, is distinguishing between ultimate and proximate explanations of things. And so really we kind of see these two different ways that we might explain something that happens, some behavior, some action. We have two ways to try and explain why we see that occur. And so ultimate explanations are explanations of a behavior or an action that must appeal to evolution, right? So they have to sort of have this biological component to them, whereas proximate explanations are more just functional or realistic, or apply to the real world more in nature. And so if we kind of think about these as, in this example, we can think about the scenario where, we have a baby that's crying. And why are they crying? Well, and what does the caregiver do to deal with that crying? Well, we can see both proximate and ultimate causes of these two things. So an ultimate cause, right, which must appeal to evolution, might be that the baby is crying because it needs food, and the caregiver is going to take care of it to help it survive, and that solution is biological in nature. It is to help the survival of the species, or of the baby. So that is an ultimate cause or an ultimate explanation to the behavior. Whereas a proximate cause or proximate explanation might be that, something else is going on. Maybe there's some kind of just like noise or sound that is bothering the baby, and it's crying because of that. And the caregiver might go remove that noise. But it's more of an applied sort of function-driven explanation to why they're crying. And so we see these two different things. This is a very basic example, but we see these two different explanations to behavior kind of crop up in ways that we address and explain this throughout different time points and different kind of theories within psychology. Again, kind of what we just discussed here between these two different things, ultimate and proximate explanations. Again, just kind of reiterating this, ultimate are explanations of why behaviors exist that appeal to evolution, survival, things like that, whereas proximate explanations are more functional, process-oriented, specifically in nature, and happen more, or are more explained in the real world pieces of this in general. And so when we talk about evolution and the evolutionary influences and how this sort of plays a role here, we can see sort of the effect of gene and context, how these two things both kind of affect behavior. So gene level, we might see behaviors being presented or passed on, again, as a way to provide that, as a way to provide that gene as a continuation. Whereas we might have more context-driven behavior where we explain things through the context of the environment, just another sort of way to explain sort of this difference between ultimate and proximate, where we have more of evolution-driven gene, biology-driven versus context, nurture, real-world sort of driven behaviors. It's just another way to kind of distinguish these two things. So this is really cool. I'm going to play this video real quick. It's just a short sort of animation, but you'll see here that we sort of go through and we're scanning and sort of being able to see the full sort of spectrum of the brain. And so this really is kind of cool and talks about some of the new ways that we've been able to develop technology and be able to actually uncover and witness what's inside and what's going on within the brain. I find this really cool. And just kind of being able to see some of what's going on in this more applied context, I think is really cool. And so when we look at like early structuralism versus modern structuralism and looking at the actual structures of the brain and how it actually functions, we see sort of, well, we've learned a lot once we've actually been able to see inside the brain. And so again, if we look at this, we can see a lot of these structures, a lot of these components of the brain. Specifically, you know, we see things like the frontal lobe up here. We have the occipital lobe back here, the cerebellum, areas of the brain that we have identified and been able to say that these are responsible. These are what we can see and observe, and what they do in their function is really cool, I think. Something we weren't able to do before these technologies existed in our ability to sort of see those. So again, just kind of a cool component of sort of looking at the advancements in technology and how those have helped us in uncovering and understanding the brain as well. And so we have both those physical components of understanding the mind and understanding the brain, observing it structurally, seeing the actual brain. And then we have more of the cognitive influences as well. So being able to consider the experience, the behavior, the mind, and what these things all kind of do and say about a person, and understanding just the influence to their psychology from this perspective. And so we see a lot of kind of these different ways that we approach this. And in reality, you know, we kind of take into account all of these different pieces. But generally speaking, you know, we kind of look at these two approaches to understanding psychology, or you know, how we study behavior, how we study people, and we look at both that physical structural side of things now and the more nuanced cognitive side of things, behavioral things like that. And so these two things kind of put together help us get a big picture or a more full picture of the person and understanding different things about them and sort of why they are or behave the way that they behave. All right, and so that wraps up this first chapter. I hope that it gave you some information and some insight into just the field in general. And generally speaking, I think, again, psychology is really cool. There's a lot of different pieces of it. This was only a little bit about what it is. We're going to get into a lot of these concepts, a lot of these components in more detail as we go through the rest of the semester.